this morning to introduce somebody who I have so much respect for. This is a man who has tirelessly fought for the free market principles that we all love, right? Senator Johnson not only retired Russ Feingold, but he then went on a crusade against spending and debt in Washington, and he hasn't stopped since. Please help me welcome Senator
I will suggest, normally I'm asking people to come forward. If you can't see the screen, I suggest you maybe go back so you can't see it. It's not critical. Right. Can you hear me? There you go. I'm a little bit closer to the mic here than Luke. I want to make sure I know. Okay, good. It's working. Let me start out, first of all, by thanking all of you for being involved. It is true, you are the last line of defense in terms of defending our freedoms. It's just true. Now, I give my little PowerPoint presentation. I love giving it to bipartisan crowds. I actually we were in Madison just a couple days ago, the belly of the beast, and I gave it in front of the Madison Rotary. It was kind of funny because you had people sitting there like this. In the end, about a third of the crowd gave me a standing ovation, so it's not, all hope isn't lost, even in Madison, Wisconsin.
Amazing.
But I want to start out the way I would start with the bipartisan crowd, because it just might give you a little ammunition as once you've learned the information, as you start trying to convey it, start trying to win the argument with your, let's say, less conservative friends. You know, as a business guy, I certainly found it very easy, or it was a really good technique on the front end of any negotiation, to figure out what you agree on. Before you start getting into arguing over what you disagree on, let's clear it out. Let's spend a fair amount of time. What do you agree on? It develops this level of relationship, it develops a level of trust. So when you start working with the disagreements, it's a lot easier to find common ground. So certainly when I talk to a crowd full of liberals, or when liberals come into my office begging for government funding, I start out like this. We share the same goal. I believe that's true. We all want a prosperous America. That name right there, America's Prosperity. We really do all want a prosperous America. I'm concerned about every American. I know those guys are too. We all want every American to have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves and their family. Now, it's true. We have a wide diversity of opinion on what it takes to produce that prosperity. But at least as we start facing these enormous challenges, it would be very helpful if we don't start off questioning each other's motives. I truly believe that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to send you through a little PowerPoint presentation that I've developed since my time in the Senate, utilizing my accounting background. It'll demonstrate to you, and I will apologize up front. Any smiles on your faces will probably get wiped away.
Thanks.
But then I'm going to leave enough time to answer questions. Anything's fair game. Don't worry about it. I can hopefully handle anything you have to throw at me. So let's start hopping right into my PowerPoint presentation that lays out sort of the fiscal situation of this country. And it starts with the first chart I ever produced as U.S. Senator. I don't think very many people understand that only 100 years ago, and I got white hair, 100 years ago used to seem like a long time. It's not. Only 100 years ago, the federal government was 2% of our economy. In other words, 2 cents of the economy produced was consumed by the federal government. Back then, state and local governments were 5%. So the total government take out of our economy only 100 years ago was 7%. I would argue that was the vision of our founding fathers. A limited federal government. What government that we had out there was close to the government. In the states, in the municipalities. If anybody here serve on a school board or a city government, okay, you know local government is accountable, right? If you're going to propose a property tax increase, you know the citizens of your community are going to be at your city council meeting demanding that money is well spent. You remove government out of the community. Take it to a place like Madison, Wisconsin. Even with Governor Walker, it's a little less accountable, a little less under control. But, you know, the good thing about state governments is most of them are constrained by some kind of requirement for a balanced budget. Now, they can play games with their pension accounting, that type of thing, but by and large, the states are in far better financial condition than the federal government. So when you remove government, you ship it off to this alternate universe, this alternate reality, this place called Washington, D.C., the city in which I serve. It's out of control. It's unaccountable. And we can see that right now by the stats. So over the last 100 years, the federal government has grown to consuming, right now it's a little less than 23%, but the problem is we're on a trajectory just in the next 20 years to hit 34%. If you add in state and local governments, we're already at 37% on a trajectory to hit 49% in just 20 years. Now, I don't think this is theory. This isn't conjecture. This is not an economic model that works. It fails. Every place it's tried, it's failed. Look at the Soviet Union. Venezuela is an oil-rich nation. It's a basket case after Hugo Chavez's experiment. I do like to point out how many people vacation in the island paradise of Cuba. When the government consumes this much of an economy, it fails. I have no idea why anybody would want us to put America on this path, this path to Greece, where we see riots in the streets, but unfortunately, this is the path we're on. This is our challenge. This is what we have to reverse. Now, because I'm a fiscal conservative, I hear it all the time. I'm being accused of wanting to impose on America austere spending, draconian spending cuts. Well, let's just look at the facts, because facts are kind of hard to argue with. 10 years ago, the federal government spent $3.2 trillion. Last year, this year, we're spending about $3.6 trillion. It's too high from my standpoint. You got to at least give yourselves credit for electing people in 2010 to at least stop the growth in federal spending momentarily. So $3.6 trillion. And the argument moving forward is the House budget proposes spending $5 trillion 10 years in the future. President Obama's Democrats in the Senate wants to spend 5.7. Now, you don't have to be an accountant or math major to take a look at this and go, in total, nobody is proposing cutting the federal government spending. All we're trying to do is reduce the rate of growth. That's an incredibly important distinction, a pretty important argument to be using against liberals. Another way of looking at this, 10-year spending. 2 decades ago, the federal government spent $17 trillion. Last decade, $31 trillion. And the argument moving forward is, are we going to spend $41 trillion over the next 10 years or 47? Again, no cuts, just reducing growth. Now, if you've ever heard the term $6 trillion of draconian cuts, that's kind of a standard talking point. That's what they're talking about. The difference between spending $41 and $47 trillion over the next 10 years. Then that slide kind of shows why we have, whoa, that's out of order. Hang on. I'll come back to that one. Very few people realize how much of the federal government is out of control. In the 60s, 68% of the federal government was appropriated. Discretionary spending, it came under some level, I know it's an oxymoron, of congressional control. 32% was mandatory. Back then, primarily Social Security and interest on the debt. Today, that's been reversed. Now only a third, 34%, is discretionary spending. It's about $1 trillion out of that $3.6 trillion. The rest is all mandatory. It's on automatic pilot. It's out of control. That's Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Social Security, interest on the debt. If we don't solve this problem in 10 years, only 24% will be appropriate. You have 76% on automatic pilot. Now, I come from the private sector. If I ran my business like this, if you ran your business like this, you'd be bankrupt. You'd have 0 employees, and the point I'm making is the federal government is bankrupt. The only reason it's not functionally bankrupt is because we are still the world's reserve currency. We got the printing press. We're printing money. We are delaying our day of reckoning. But tell you what, Brazil, India, Russia, China, they're trying to displace the U.S. currency as the world's reserve currency. They're trying to come up with a basket of currencies. When that happens, we are in deep trouble. Now, one of the things I try and do with my PowerPoint presentation is try and drive it home to individuals. I mean, we are so immune to trillions of dollars. I mean, I knew we had a problem. We went from hundreds of billions of dollars of deficit that people were outraged about to $1 trillion, $1.4 trillion. You know what? What's a couple $1 trillion, right? Among friends? What's $1,000 billion? So one way of driving this point, making it personal, is your share of the federal debt. Today it's at $52,000 per person. 10 years ago it was at $36,000. 10 years in the future it'll be $75,000. Now, I give this PowerPoint presentation to college campuses. When I'm talking to young people, I really have them concentrate on that $75,000 10 years in the future. But then I say, because you're young, you better tack on $150,000 for your grandparents' share, $150,000 for your parents' share, because that debt's not going away. It's going to be on your backs. It's going to be on the backs of your kids and your grandkids. Do you understand what we're doing to future generations? I don't know personally a parent or parents who would willingly drive up their personal debt, max out their credit cards, never intending to pay it off, but fully intending to pass it on to their kids and grandkids. And thank God, I don't know anybody like that, except collectively that's exactly what we're doing. What I try and do in these presentations, the analogy I use, I'm trying to grab America by the lapels and, God, you know what you're doing to your kids? The immorality, that intergenerational theft, it's got to stop. Until America collectively understands what it's doing to the future generation, we're not going to come to grips with these problems. Now, I mentioned Greece earlier. The riots in the streets, we've seen them. On this one metric, you'd be better off being a citizen of Greece because they're where we were 4 years ago. They're $35,000. Again, the only reason we don't have riots in the streets, we got that printing press, we're printing money. Let me move on and talk about one of those mandatory spending programs, the granddaddy of them all, Social Security. Now, I want to admit I was wrong. Way before I decided running for the U.S. Senate, I gave a little Tea Party speech in Oshkosh, and I called it Social Security Ponzi scheme, and I was wrong. Because a Ponzi scheme is illegal. When the federal government runs a Ponzi scheme, it's legal. So this is a legal Ponzi scheme, so let's correct the record. Now, the fact of the matter is, Social Security, since its inception, almost without exception, it ran a surplus. About $2.6 trillion when you have the interest it paid on, that it was paid on the bonds. And Al Gore was right. We have a lockbox. There's a Social Security Trust Fund. We invested those surpluses in U.S. government bonds. Now, of course, the problem with Social Security is in 2010, in what I was considering a very ill-advised payroll tax holiday, we started defunding America's retirement plan, and we went cash deficit. And we're going to continue to be cash deficit. We will pay out $5.1 trillion more in benefits than we will take in the payroll tax. So over the next 30 years, it's $11 trillion. Now, there's no way you can look at that fact. And this is fact. This is actuarial math. This is pretty solid statistics here. The only way anybody can look at that and lie to you and say that Social Security is solvent is because of the fiction of that Social Security Trust Fund. Now, and the reason it's a fiction is U.S. government bonds held in the hands of the federal government is the same thing as if you had $20, spent it, that money spent, it is long gone. It's been redistributed. And you write yourself a little note that says $20 stuffed in your pocket. You go, hey, I got $20. No, you don't. You got a pretty little piece of paper that you're going to have to convince somebody else to give you a real $20 so you can spend it again as a promissory note. And by the way, I'm not the only one that says the Social Security Trust Fund has no value to the federal government. The Office of Management and Budget, part of the U.S. Treasury Department, part of every administration in a 2010 document, admitted the same thing. Here's a couple quotes. It says that basically the Social Security Trust Fund is available for future benefits, but only in a bookkeeping sense. They're not assets that can really be drawn down to fund future benefits because the OMB recognized that, yeah, you got an asset in the trust fund worth $2.6 trillion. The U.S. Treasury Department has the liability on the other side of the books. You consolidate your set of books, $2.6 trillion, net it against $2.6 trillion equals zero. It nets to zero, it has no value. Now, I've had Treasury Secretary Lew, OMB Director Burwell, OMB Acting Director Zients in front of the Budget Committee. I've run this exact same thing through past them to try and get them to admit the Social Security Trust Fund has no value to pay off that $5.1 trillion worth of benefits. They won't buy it. They will not admit it. They continue to lie. And that's part of our problem. But let me admit, though, like I said, Al Gore was right. There is a lockbox. I got a picture of it. It's right there. If it weren't true, if it weren't so sad, it would be funny. But that's it. It's a 4-drawer file sitting somewhere in Virginia. It's got locks on it, by the way, which is kind of humorous because these are non-marketable securities. I really think if somebody stole them and presented them to Jacob Lew, I think he'd be smart enough to go, no, I'm not going to give you $2.6 trillion. You know? But anyway, that's what we got. Okay, now I got to go back to my other one. Pretend you ever saw that. I'm one of those senators that was on the charm offensive. And by the way, I truly appreciate the fact that President Obama reached out. If you're going to start solving these problems, you got to start talking, right? So I repeatedly say that that initial dinner, if Americans could have been a fly in the wall, they would have been heartened by the discussion. I mean, honestly, they would have. It was full, it was complete, it was direct, it was honest, it was frank. You know, you had 12 senators, a lot of them served President Obama, they were his friends. You know, Tom Coburn, President Obama, you cannot get further apart on the political spectrum, yet these men are friends. They care about each other. It's not a bad place to start. President Obama opened up that dinner, laying out the problem as he saw it. He was pretty accurate about it. He said, you know, in terms of the federal budget, it's healthcare spending. It's Medicare. He said, but the problem in reforming Medicare is that for every dollar that Americans pay into the system, they're going to get $3 in benefits. And interesting enough, he went on to say, and most Americans don't understand that. Could it be because publicly the only thing he said about Medicare is that he needs modest reforms? So anyway, he concluded his remarks. He started going around the table as the second senator responded to him. I said, listen, Mr. President, first of all, thanks for having us. I said, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that $1 in, $3 out. And the 12 Republican senators around the table, we've been making that same argument. But we're very little voices, Mr. President, compared to your platform. It would be enormously helpful, Mr. President, if you utilize that platform. And our first act of bipartisanship will be to define the problem and then collectively go to the American public and describe it to them. So America is actually ready for these solutions. It won't be fun. It won't be fun. I mean, I ran for the United States Senate. I actually wanted to be a senator because I wanted somebody there who was willing to take the tough votes, not knowing about the election. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to get that chance in the first 6 years. But anyway, the talks progressed. President Obama offered his staff to us. We've been meeting with the Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, Sylvia Burwell, Rod Neighbors. My contribution has been trying to get them to first acknowledge and admit they've got a problem, and secondly, define it. So the problem I saw in all of our budget talks is we confine ourselves to a 10-year budget window, which dramatically understates the problem. So my Republican colleagues agreed with that approach, so they gave me Orrin Hatch's finance staff, the budget staff, my staff, Corbin's staff. So in a couple of weeks, we developed a model. Because, you know, we've all seen that hockey stick chart, long-term deficits. Never any numbers attached to it, because it's always accompanied by a statement like, well, at that point, the model just blows up. Trust me, the model doesn't blow up, it just produces really big, mean, ugly numbers that people don't want to face. Well, we got to face them. I'm going to make you face them. So, the fact of the matter is, the first decade, here's our results. The first decade got a deficit of about $7 trillion, which allows Simpson goals to, if you want to stabilize your deficit, say, well, we got to reduce our deficits by about $4 to $5 trillion. So everybody gloms onto that. We got a $4 to $5 trillion problem. Let's try and solve that. The president claims he's already solved 1.5 or 2.5 trillion, 1.5 to go. You know, give me tax increases. I'll give you little spending cuts that aren't real. We can go home and say it's all solved. But here's the problem. Second decade, the deficit's $28 trillion. Third decade's at $71 trillion. Total deficit of $107 trillion over 30 years. Now, this is our second scenario. The first time we cranked up the numbers about $72 trillion, but the spending categories compared to the historic levels of GDP were way low. So we had to reset some numbers, did this, came up 107, presented this to AEI and Cato. They came back and said, you're still too low. It's a projection, but it gives you the magnitude of the problem that we're grappling with. And it's a problem, quite honestly, that the vast majority of Americans don't know about. And the vast majority of members of Congress, people in Washington, aren't willing to even acknowledge, much less start working towards solutions to solve it. Now, $107 trillion is an incomprehensible figure. Let me relate it to something so you can put it in perspective. The total net private asset base of the United States, all assets held by every household, every asset held by businesses large and small, is $96 trillion today. So in other words, our 30-year projected deficit exceeds the total net private asset base of America. Now, again, you don't have to be an accountant to recognize we got a problem. We got a real problem. Let me skip through the slides here. This is my graphic depiction of a debt crisis. From 1970 to 1999, the average interest rate that the federal government paid on its debt was 5.3%. Now, sounds like a pretty reasonable interest rate, right? Probably what most people's mortgages are. By the way, we paid this when we were a far more creditworthy nation. Our debt to GDP ratio during that time frame was somewhere between 45 and 67%. Today, our debt to GDP ratio exceeds 100% because our debt exceeds the size of our economy. For the last 4 years, because we got the printing press, and we've been printing money, we've been able to keep interest rates artificially low so government doesn't feel the pain of all this deficit spending. Our kids will feel the pain. Now, what happens in a debt crisis? What happens is, let's say we're no longer the world's reserve currency. We're only one of them. And creditors from around the world look at the U.S. and go, you guys are not getting serious about solving this financial problem in your country. They say, you're credit risk. We're not going to loan you money, not at that rate. And interest rates spike. By the way, CBO projects interest rates will be at 5.5% by the end of the decade, just 10 years. If that were to happen sooner than that, though, if interest rates spike like they did in Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, okay, we're not immune. If that happened, our interest payment per year would increase by more than $600 billion. Now let me put that in perspective. That's a number that's larger. It's basically what we spend on defense. It's more than we spend on Medicare. It's not quite what we spend on Social Security now. So we're not only talking about a debt crisis in that event. Can you imagine the political crisis that interest expense would create when it starts crowding out all the spending and all these other promises we made that made no adequate provision to pay for. Now, that concludes my depressing budget stance. I apologize. I've done what I'm good at doing. I've taken a room of at least partially smiling faces and turned them into frowns. All right, Ron Johnson. My main point, really the theory of my running for office, what really is the driving force of my Senate office is to prove this point, the root cause of our problem. Is the size, the scope, all the rules, all the regulations, all of government's intrusion into our lives, and the resulting cost of that government. That's the root cause. Everything else are severe symptoms, but I'm a manufacturer, it's in my DNA. Attack the root cause. It really is government, like Ronald Reagan. It's not the solution, it's the problem. The next two set of slides are just my little way of conveying, at least in a couple areas, where I at least want people thinking about maybe government's good intentions actually had very severe negative unintended consequences and really were the source of the problem. So I said I give this talk quite a bit in colleges. So I thought I'd use a metric that maybe the kids might be concerned about, the cost of college. In the 60s, 1 year at college, this is tuition, room and board, cost about $1,000. Now, if those costs would have just increased by the rate of inflation, today college ought to cost a little under $7,400. But in fact, it costs closer to $18,000. So the cost of a 1 year in college has increased at 2.4 times the rate of inflation since the 60s. Now, why is that? What is so different about what colleges and universities spend their money on that their costs would increase at 2.4 times the rate of inflation? I mean, could it be the fact that since the 60s, the federal government has poured money into it with all the greatest intentions? You know, we want to make college accessible to kids. But the problem is, in our attempt to make college more accessible, we've made it less accessible because we made it less affordable. By the way, we've also enticed our children to collectively take on $1 trillion of student loan debt. Their average student loan debt now is a little under $30,000. And a really depressing study, not that you need to be depressed further, came out of Northeastern University and said that 50% of recent college graduates are either unemployed or employed in jobs that require no college education at all, and they've got an average debt a little under $30,000. Do you understand the disservice we've done to our kids? As we've enticed them into that debt, we've offered colleges and universities courses in graduate degrees of blankety-blank studies that employers just don't value. It's a huge disservice, but here's kind of proof of putting here. Inflation's gone up about 500% since the 70s. College costs $1,000 and college aid 1,500%. I just ask people to think about it. Could our wonderful intentions cause this problem? I would argue yes, they did. Now here's the last one. I don't do this because I think this is the road to re-election. This is going to make me politically popular, talking about how to wedlock birth rates. This is something, these are truths that America must start facing. So I happen to believe the family is the foundational building block of any successful society. Now this is, by the way, this is no way to denigrate single parents to do a phenomenal job raising great kids. This is not a value judgment of one versus the other. It's a statement that if you can have intact families, you have a far lower rate of poverty. You have a far lower probability of being touched by poverty. And I'm not the only guy concerned about this kind of stuff. Back in the 60s, first guy I heard talk about this was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He became a Democrat senator from New York. He was alarmed at this. He looked from 40 to mid-60s, out of wedlock birth rates had doubled from 4% to 8%. He was concerned about it. The other thing that's happened in the 60s, we had the boob tube. So the first time in American history, we had images of abject poverty being telecast, broadcast into our living rooms. We didn't like it. America is a compassionate society. We all believe in a strong social safety net. We want to help people that can't help themselves. We want to help people help themselves. But here's the problem. How do you design a strong social safety net that is confined to the people that need it? Well, it doesn't start creeping into populations that don't really quite need it, to creeping and creeping and creeping to people that don't need it at all, but are happy to game the system, and in so doing bankrupt your nation. Well, anyway, we're back in the 60s, and poverty rates, they're too high. They've actually falling since we started measuring in the 50s, but they're still too high at 12%. Number of people in poverty, also a declining statistic, but still too high. So again, we're a compassionate society. We collectively embark on a $16 trillion war on poverty. That's what we spent. It's, I guess, mere coincidence that that's about what our federal debt is. $16 trillion. Well, now, I'm in Washington. I'm an accountant. I like to measure things. I like to measure results. Hey, did it work? Well, I'll guarantee you the federal government does not measure the intended consequences of what it does, which is why we've got 60 or 70 jobs training programs. And nobody can tell you that any of them work. But they seem like a good idea, so let's pass another one and spend a couple extra $1 billion, right? I will guarantee you the federal government does not even consider the unintended consequences, much less measure those. Very negative unintended consequences. So anyway, let's do a little Monday morning quarterbacking here. Did all of our good intentions, did $16 trillion solve poverty? The number of people in poverty went from 23 million to 43. Now, you can argue, yeah, but our population increase, that's not unusual. Okay, so poverty rate ought to be the better measure. What happened there? 12% to, it's varied, but we're at 14% now. We didn't fix the problem. It's obvious. We didn't even make a dent in it. I would say we dramatically exacerbated it. How about this last step? This incredibly dangerous societal measure, God wedlock birth rates. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Maybe all of our good intentions at least kept the family intact. No, we destroyed the American family. Now, the question I want people to ask, could have all of those good intentions not only contributed to this, but be the primary cause?
Yes.
Let me illustrate the point.
Government should.
When I talk about a single mom, that I must emphasize, we all have a great deal of compassion for her. We want to help this woman. She's struggling. And by the way, the reason I'm talking about this is the first guy I met on the campaign trail was Glenn Grothman. And his stump speech was all about the single mom. And what he did is he got her salary about $15,000 part-time. Then he added up the dollar value of all the state and federal government benefits she got. And he totaled it to her salary. It's about $51,000. By the way, that's tax-free. Now, because I get PolitiFact checked and all this, I had my Senate staff look at it. We came up with about $43,000 total. Depends on your assumptions. So somewhere in that range, 43 to 51. Now, in a longer, more depressing PowerPoint presentation, I would have shown that median household income during our recovery, under Obamonomics, has declined from about $55,000 to $51,000. But keep in mind, that's taxable. That's median household income, taxable. Now, here's the thought experiment that I watched the welfare department in Pennsylvania. He did a really exhaustive study on single motherhood. And said that a single mom in Pennsylvania, can make up to $26,000. And every dollar of income up to $26,000, she realizes the benefit, a net marginal benefit. Beyond $26,000, with increasing taxes and reduction in benefits, she basically has a 100% marginal tax rate. It has no value to her to work beyond $26,000 until she makes like $65,000. So government programs incentivize this young woman to stop working at $26,000 and not work another minute unless she has the miracle of being able to take a job that starts paying her more than $65,000. Now, until Americans understand what I just presented here, take a look at the incredibly harmful unintended consequences of our good intentions, until we start looking at these facts with our eyes wide open, start understanding what we're doing with our children and grandchildren, future generations, how we are depriving them of future opportunity and prosperity, we are not going to come to grips to be able to start working toward real solutions. That's where you folks come in. You've got to be our force multipliers. If you got a business, start talking to people who work with you. You've got a great deal of credibility with those individuals. All this information is on my Senate website, ronjohnson.senate.com. You can download these. You can start having these conversations. This is nonpartisan. It's bulletproof. If you've got relationships with other people, friends, family, neighbors, total strangers, get informed, spread the information around, because let's face it, our education system's not going to do it. Our media, either entertainment or news, is not going to do it. Political campaigns, I don't know, we spent $6 or $7 billion in the last one. What did America learn? What a dirty, rotten rascal the opponent was. And we also learned to lie. Just make the rich pay their fair share and do a balanced approach to deficit reduction, and all will be well. Well, we realize that's not the case either. So again, as I started, I'll conclude. You, we the people, are the last line of defense to save this nation and create the prosperity that we hunger for. So God bless your efforts, and I'm happy to take questions.
Staff members walk around with the microphone, so if you guys have questions, just stand up and raise your hand and we'll get to you. Go ahead. Go ahead. Right here.
Senator, question on Obamacare.
Yep.
What percent of the spending on Obamacare is mandatory? What percent is discretionary?
Right.
And can Congress stop Obamacare by defunding the discretionary spending?
Okay. Basically, it would all be deemed mandatory. I don't know the exact breakout. Even as it's labeled, it's probably more than 90%. It's probably 95, close to 99. Take a look at the letter that Tom Coburn requested from the Congressional Research Service on defunding, and you'll see the civil opinion because of the necessary implication. Even again, 2/3 of the budget is mandatory. It's going to be spent no matter what. All we're arguing about on the continuing resolution is funding the other third. Obamacare is a law. It's almost all mandatory spending, but even the discretionary portion of that, because the other part is mandatory, would be deemed mandatory in a government shutdown situation, and it would also be spent. So short of passing law, not just through the House, but through Harry Reid's Senate, which, by the way, it's impossible to convey how dysfunctional not only Harry Reid's Senate is, but Washington in general. And then President Obama would have to sign that law. It's the only way we could really defund it. Which is why I think the better strategy is take advantage of some Democrats who are starting to agree with us, that, including President Obama, by the way. Harry Reid, the mass block is called a train wreck. It is. President Obama agreed. That's why he delayed the employer mandate and the income verification and a bunch of other provisions. So I think a better strategy is let's push to delaying it for 1 year. The other thing I would suggest we attach to this continuing resolution, must pass piece of legislation, is we've never had the leverage to not pass a continuing resolution or not increase the deficit, because you've got this Armageddon-like shutdown talking point. You can see most of the government will still be funded regardless. Let's take that talking point off the table. Let's pass a full faith and credit or a limited shutdown, managed shutdown. If we don't pass the CR, Rob Portman's got a bill. we'll just fund the government at current levels. If we can't come to agreement on something, 90 days, drop it 1%, another 90 days, another drop it again. Let's put in the fiscal discipline, the controls, but also set us up for a time when the President of the United States comes to Congress. And by the way, he doesn't even want to have a debate on this, but asking Congress to increase the debt burden on our children and grandchildren, he doesn't want to debate on that? No, we got to have a serious debate, but we have to put ourselves in a position to have the leverage to not pass an increase in debt ceiling. Most government would go on, all the good stuff, the things that has to go on. The stuff that wouldn't go on would be things the American public would not even know or care about. We got to put ourselves in that position. From my standpoint, that's the must-have. And by the way, let's say that's the only thing we extract from the continuing resolution. Do you think President Obama would be able to not sign a bill that funds the government, and the only thing attached to it would be bills that would prevent future brinkmanship and future government shutdowns? I think that would be kind of a hard thing for him to resist. We got to be smart strategically in terms of something we can win on. We got to win.
Have
Next.
backbone, defund the man.
Yeah.
It's reactionary. Wake up.
Ma'am, how do you do it? How do you do it?
Attach it to the CR. Say,
I understand. I understand. So do you think Harry Reid would pass that bill? President Obama will sign it?
No. You be strong.
But we can't, unless Harry Reid passes a bill and President Obama signs it, it's going to be spent.
Be strong.
I am strong. Let me just make a statement here. I understand. Here, listen. I don't know another member of Congress that spent $9 million of their own money. You think I wanted to do that? You think that was fun to do? You think that was somewhat painful? To run for Senate, to be the vote to repeal Obamacare. I am fighting hard to repeal this thing. Nobody in Congress wants to repeal Obamacare more than me. But at the same time, I've also run businesses. I've done a lot of strategic planning. You know what you start with in terms of developing strategies? Reality. You got to set yourself up for an achievable goal. One more statement, I'll repeat it in the other room. If we remain united, we just might have a chance of saving this nation. If we are divided, we will lose, and America will lose. Understand that well.
One more question, and then we have to get out of this room because they're going to fix the air conditioning for the next session.
That'd be great.
Go ahead.
Who's got a mic?
Go ahead.
I don't care. There you go.
Thank you for your presentation. Every democracy throughout history has realized it can fund themselves through treasury, and they destroy the nation.
Right.
Every democracy. 96% of your peers get reelected over the last 40 years. Our process is broken. What do you propose to fix the process that causes this?
I understand. I understand the process is important. But go back to the root cause. It's not that there aren't some good people in Washington, D.C. It's because they're trying to do something that's impossible to do. The federal government was not intended, it's not designed, it's not capable of doing the things it's doing. But the only way we're going to change that, the only way we stop the growth of government, the only way we limit it, the only way we start shrinking it as a percentage of the size of the economy, we got to win elections. I hate to say that, but we've got to have elections because the other side wants to grow government. It is what they do. It's their strategy. They think America's government. So we got to win. We got to have the people take the votes. And that's why I'm saying it's we the people. It is the grassroots that got to elect more citizen legislators that are going there, not because they want to be reelected. Guys, you know, what I guarantee to the state of Wisconsin, first of all, I would never increase people's taxes, and I would never vote with my re-election mind. I want to go back to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I love that life. I would be happy to return. Keep fighting for America.
Speak for yourself.